On a gloomy December afternoon in 2018, the notification showed up at precisely 3:12 p.m. on the computer screen of Detective Matt Denninger. He had been working cold cases for the Cedar Rapids Police Department for 23 years, and over that time he had developed an instinct for spotting pivotal moments before his conscious mind had a chance to fully comprehend their significance. The GEDmatch genealogical database alert had been waiting in his inbox for less than 4 minutes, but something about the case number made his hand pause over the mouse. Martinko Michelle Marie's last known location. Denninger leaned back in his chair on December 19, 1979, as the fluorescent lights of the department's third-floor investigative unit cast harsh angles across the stack of manila folders that had always populated his workspace. For 39 years, he had worked cases that spanned decades, but nothing came close to this temporal distance. In 1979, DNA forensic analysis was only discussed in theoretical papers that were published by molecular biologists whose work appeared to be detached from the practice of law enforcement. The double helix structure had been understood for decades, but the notion that microscopic genetic material could identify a killer belonged firmly in the realm of science fiction. However, Jerry Lynn Burns's DNA matched biological evidence recovered from an 18-year-old woman's body in the Westdale Mall parking lot 39 years earlier, glowing on his monitor. Every presumption Denninger had about the limitations of forensic retrospection was busted by the match itself. Burns had submitted his DNA to a public genealogy website in search of family tree information. He had no idea that his genetic code would link him to a brutal crime that took place while Jimmy Carter was in charge of the White House. Due to a fortunate coincidence and careful initial investigation, the evidence had been preserved. Blood samples collected from Michelle Martino's clothing in December 1979 had been stored in the Cedar Rapids Police Department's evidence facility, surviving multiple relocations and administrative reorganizations that had destroyed a plethora of additional case materials. Only in 2017 were the samples digitized and reanalyzed as part of a grant-funded project that used cutting-edge extraction techniques to recover genetic profiles from degraded samples that previous technology would have deemed useless. The samples had been biological evidence for decades. Denninger pulled up Michelle Martino's case file, watching the digitized photographs load on his screen with the deliberate slowness of an overworked server processing images with high resolution. A young face materialized from the pixels, a senior portrait taken in autumn 1979, 3 months before her death. Michelle had been 18 years old, a senior at Kennedy High School, member of the choir, daughter of Janet and Albert Martino. She had been killed in the front seat of her family's Buick Electra while Christmas shopping on a Thursday evening, stabbed 29 times in a frenzy of violence that had shocked Cedar Rapids' sense of itself as a safe Midwestern community. Consider staying with this story to see how science is finally delivering justice that seemed impossible just a decade ago if you are following this investigation and want to comprehend how genetic genealogy is solving cases that appeared to be permanently unsolvable. The initial investigation file consisted of over 600 pages of documentation that represented thousands of hours spent by detectives pursuing every available lead using 1979's tools. No security camera footage was present. The technology was not yet commonplace in retail settings. There were no phone records to be found. Mobile phones remained expensive novelties used primarily by business executives. DNA analysis was not possible. The forensic application of genetic science was still years away from practical implementation. The investigation had relied entirely on physical evidence, witness testimony, and traditional detective work. Denninger found himself studying the evidence inventory list typed on an IBM Selectric with its distinctive font, Electric, meticulously cataloged for each item. Item 14. A female winter coat has a reddish-brown, significant bloodstain on the front panel and right sleeve. Item 15. Blood samples taken from the driver's seat, dashboard, and steering wheel of the vehicle. Item 16. Fingernail scrapings obtained from the autopsy. Possible presence of foreign tissue. What struck Denninger was the prescience embedded in that decades-old evidence collection. The original investigators couldn't have known they were preserving genetic material that would remain unintelligible for an additional 15 years. Those blood samples contained molecular signatures that would serve as the basis for Michelle's justice. However, it wasn't until technologies emerged that transformed forensic science into a molecular precision instrument that those signatures could be found in those blood samples. On Thursday, December 19, 1979, Michelle Martino awoke to the sound of her clock radio playing Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. The Iowa winter had arrived early that year, and frost etched elaborate patterns across her bedroom window, refracting the pale morning sunlight into prismatic fragments that danced across her walls. The two-story colonial house on 8th Avenue Northeast belonged to a well-established neighborhood in Cedar Rapids where families had established roots and witnessed their children's development during the post-war era of prosperity. The day held particular significance for Michelle. She had planned to finish her Christmas shopping at Westdale Mall that evening as school was ending early for winter break. Her mother, Janet, had made French toast for breakfast, a Thursday custom that Michelle had followed ever since she started high school. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter as Michelle descended the stairs, her blonde hair still damp from the shower, wearing the red winter coat that would later become central evidence in the investigation into her death. The minute details that her family later reconstructed for investigators revealed Michelle's personality. She was methodical about planning, keeping a detailed agenda book in which she meticulously wrote down her commitments and appointments. That morning's entry read, "School early release 2:15 p.m. Mall shopping evening, call Becky about Friday." She was saving money from her part-time job at J.C. Penney to buy Christmas presents for her parents and younger sister, refusing to accept money from her father despite his offers to contribute. The steady, affectionate dynamics of a family were reflected in Michelle's relationship with her parents. Albert Martino worked as an electrical engineer at Rockwell Collins, the aerospace and defense company that anchored Cedar Rapids' economy. Janet volunteered at their Lutheran church and served on the Kennedy High School Parent Committee. Michelle had the freedom to drive herself to evening activities without the hovering supervision that would later become common because they had raised their daughters with the expectation of trust. Kennedy High School released its students at 2:15 p.m. that afternoon, and Michelle had made plans to drive directly to Westdale Mall before the evening shopping rush intensified. She drove a 1977 Mazda GLC, but that day she borrowed the 1972 Buick Electra from her family out of necessity. The Buick's larger trunk could accommodate the wrapped presents she planned to purchase. The seemingly insignificant choice would later prove crucial to the investigation, as the Buick's distinctive size and color made it more memorable to potential witnesses. In 1979, Westdale Mall was the commercial hub of suburban Cedar Rapids, a sprawling single-story building with J as its linchpin, C, Penny, and Yonkers department stores surrounded by smaller specialty retailers and a food court that served as a gathering place for teenagers during winter months when outdoor activities became impractical.
The parking lot covered several acres and was divided into sections by blue, green, and red-colored signs, yellow, that helped shoppers remember where they had left their vehicles. Michelle arrived at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, parking the Buick in the mall's northwest section near the J.C. Penney entrance, where she worked part-time. Witnesses later reported seeing her enter the store, where she browsed the women's clothing department before moving to the music section. She paid with cash and carried the Supertramp's Breakfast in America album in a J.C. Penney bag as she bought it. Around 7:30 p.m., she left the store. One of the sequences in the criminal history of Cedar Rapids that received the most scrutiny would be that of Michelle's final hour alive. She was seen leaving J.C. Penney at 7:32, verified by the timestamp on her purchase receipt. The mall's closing time was 9 p.m., but many stores began shutting down their registers by 8:30, encouraging final purchases. Michelle had apparently completed her shopping earlier than planned, perhaps deterred by the crowds or unable to find the specific things she wanted. Investigators were kept in the dark about what took place over the next 30 to 45 minutes for nearly 4 decades. When Michelle didn't show up at 10 p.m. that evening, she never went home. Janet Martino called several of Michelle's friends, and as each call confirmed that no one had seen or heard from her daughter since school closed that afternoon, she became increasingly frantic. At 10:40 p.m., Albert Martino went to the Westdale Mall and looked in the parking lot for the distinctive Buick with a cream tote. By that time, the majority of the lot had been cleared out, and Albert approached Michelle's Buick with growing dread as it was immediately visible in the northwest section. Michelle had parked there nearly 6 hours earlier. Observing that despite the December cold that had enveloped Cedar Rapids with the sunset, the driver's side door was slightly ajar. He would never forget the scene that was illuminated by the dome light inside. With her red winter coat on, Michelle collapsed across the front bench seat. Her blonde hair was stained dark with blood and matted with dark evidence of a catastrophic trauma. The violence had been extreme and personal. 29 stab wounds covering her chest, face, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms where she had tried to protect herself from an attacker whose rage seemed inexhaustible. Within 8 minutes of Albert Martino's emergency call, the police from Cedar Rapids arrived. The scene was immediately secured by Patrolman James Doster and Patrolman William Chen, who recognized that the violence suggested something more than just a robbery. Michelle's purse remained in the vehicle, her wallet containing $47 in cash untouched. The J.C. Penney shopping bag sat on the passenger seat, the Supertramp album still sealed in its plastic wrapper. This was not a crime motivated by money. The stabbing represented something far more disturbing, a targeted, personal attack characterized by excessive force that spoke to rage rather than rational criminal purpose. The crime scene was processed immediately, despite the late hour in the cold December weather. Detective Lyle Lenth, a veteran investigator with the Cedar Rapids Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, arrived at 11:20 p.m. and assumed command of the investigation. Lenth understood intuitively that the first hours of a homicide investigation often determined whether it would be solved. He demanded thorough documentation of everything that could be seen inside and around the Buick, even things that might seem irrelevant to less experienced drivers. The abundant blood evidence proved both abundant and critically important. It was evident that the attacker had been hurt in the struggle. Michelle's fingernails contained tissue and blood that forensic technicians carefully collected. Understanding that foreign biological material might eventually prove useful, even though the technology to analyze it properly didn't yet exist. The patterns of blood spatter on the dashboard and steering wheel suggested a prolonged rather than a brief violent encounter. Unexpected attack, Michelle had fought for her life with desperate determination, leaving evidence of her struggle embedded in the physical traces that would wait nearly 4 decades for science to decode their meaning. The investigation that followed consumed the Cedar Rapids Police Department for months, eventually expanding to include the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The unpredictability of the attack, a young woman's unprovoked death in a mall parking lot, suggested either a stranger assault or a perpetrator skilled at concealing prior connections to the victim. Investigators interviewed hundreds of individuals, pursuing every fragment of information that might illuminate Michelle's final moments. Yet despite the intensity and thoroughness of the original investigation, no arrest was ever made, The case gradually transitioned from active to cold, joining the roster of unsolved homicides that haunted every police department. Michelle Martino's murder became a permanent wound in Cedar Rapids' collective memory, a reminder that even in safe Midwestern communities, inexplicable evil could strike without warning or apparent reason. Chapter 2. The Vigil Without End. Janet Martino's transformation began with gestures that seemed entirely reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Michelle's bedroom exactly as it was on December 19, 1979, dusting the porcelain collection and making the bed each morning with the same yellow and white gingham bedspread. Vignettes arranged on the dresser, and ensuring that Michelle's Kennedy High School textbooks remained stacked beside her desk where she had left them the morning she died. Michelle had been shopping for Christmas presents that evening, but they were never opened. Each December, Janet wrapped them herself, using receipts from Michelle's purse, and placed them under the family tree. This became an annual custom that made holiday celebrations into ceremonies of absence. In those first months after the murder, this preservation felt like an act of maternal devotion rather than the beginning of pathology. Janet told herself that maintaining Michelle's space honored her daughter's memory, that keeping the room ready meant acknowledging Michelle's permanent place in their family story. But as 1980 became 1981 and then 1982, the unchanged bedroom evolved from memorial into something more troubling, a three-dimensional photograph that refused to acknowledge the forward motion of time. Albert Martino began sleeping in the guest room during the second year after Michelle's death, unable to pass his daughter's doorway each night and see his wife sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Michelle's choir robe and conducting whispered conversations with a daughter who would never answer. The distance between Janet and Albert grew not from lack of love, but from incompatible grieving styles. Albert tried to move forward, returning to his engineering work at Rockwell Collins and forcing himself to engage with the routines of daily survival. Janet interpreted his resilience as betrayal, as though accepting that life continued somehow diminished Michelle's significance. The annual pilgrimage to the Cedar Rapids Police Department became Janet's most sacred obligation. She would drive to the department's downtown headquarters on December 19th in her finest attire and request a meeting with whoever was currently assigned to Michelle's case. The ritual persisted across multiple detective reassignments and departmental reorganizations, a constant presence that no one quite knew how to refuse or redirect. Detective Lyle Length, who had worked the original investigation, received these visits with patient compassion during his final years before retirement. Later, detectives inherited the tradition with less context and growing discomfort.
Janet's police reports became increasingly complex and detached from the investigation reality. She had obsessively corresponded with the families of other young women who had been murdered throughout the Midwest, and by 1985 she had developed elaborate theories regarding Michelle's assassination. She came to the conclusion that blonde adolescent girls in mall parking lots in Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin were being routinely targeted by a criminal network operating along Interstate 380. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more insistent, filled with connections she had drawn between Michelle's case and missing person reports with only superficial similarities between them. Winter months, young victims with blonde hair. Janet's mind alone contained the evidence supporting these theories. However, she pursued them with the same ferocity as someone who had discovered undisputed truth. Maps marked with colored pins that indicated where other girls had vanished, timelines written in increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who had been arrested for similar crimes in neighboring towns covered the walls of Michelle's bedroom. The room that had begun as a memorial transformed into an investigative command center, that would have seemed elaborate if it weren't so clearly disconnected from the actual evidence in Michelle's case. During those years, no one realized that Janet's obsessive documentation contained genuine insights, including Albert, the detectives who received her visits, or the concerned church friends who gradually stopped inviting her to social events. Her correspondence with other victims' families had created an informal network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been equipped to recognize. She noticed that several unsolved murders in eastern Iowa during the late 1970s and early 1980s shared characteristics that suggested possible connections, observations that could have been useful if they hadn't been lost in the horde of unproven theories. The way the Cedar Rapids community dealt with Janet's grief was predictable. Initial comfortable distance gradually replaced feelings of support and sympathy. After Janet distributed flyers about Michelle's unsolved murder at a Christmas bazaar planning meeting, the Lutheran Church's Women's Auxiliary stopped inviting her to volunteer events. Neighbors continued polite greetings, but avoided extended conversations that might trigger Janet's need to discuss theories about her daughter's killer. The Martino family's social isolation was not the result of cruelty, but as a result of the community's inability to deal with grief, which refused to be mended or accommodated by normal interactions. On March 8, 1993, Albert Martino passed away from a massive coronary. He was 61 years old when a coworker found him in his Rockwell Collins office during the lunch hour. The official cause was atherosclerotic heart disease, but everyone who knew the family understood the actual etiology. Albert had been worn down by the combination of unresolved issues for 13 years and was slowly dying off grief over Michelle's death and the daily experience of watching his wife vanish into an obsession with no room for the living. Janet discovered the news when two Rockwell Collins managers arrived at her door in mid-afternoon, their presence communicating tragedy before they spoke a word. Angela, Michelle's younger sister, was 12 years old when her sister was killed. Because she was so young, her memories of Michelle were distorted by her childhood perspective. Angela was 26 years old in 1993, married, living in Iowa City, and maintaining careful emotional distance from her mother's all-consuming focus on the past. She loved Janet, but had learned that every visit, every phone call, every interaction would eventually circle back to Michelle's murder and the theories that Janet continued to develop with undiminished intensity. Angela returned to Cedar Rapids for her father's funeral and faced the overwhelming task of trying to support a mother whose grip on consensual reality had become increasingly tenuous. A sizable crowd attended their Lutheran church's funeral service. Albert's colleagues from Rockwell Collins, neighbors from 8th Avenue Northeast, distant relatives who had maintained sporadic contact over the decades. Pastor David Sorensen delivered a eulogy that carefully acknowledged Albert's professional accomplishments and his devotion to family, while avoiding any direct reference to the tragedy that had defined the final years of his life. The burial's reception made it clear the extent to which Janet was isolated. She stood in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by people who had known her for decades, but she didn't seem to be able to do the usual things to help grieving people. Every condolence offered about Albert's death became a prompt for Janet to discuss Michelle's unsolved case, creating awkward interactions that left well-meaning attendees uncertain how to respond. Angela watched her mother transform the reception for her father into an impromptu presentation about the theories she had developed, including using Albert's death as evidence that Michelle's murder had been solved, but another person had been killed. After the funeral, Angela spent 3 days helping her mother sort through Albert's belongings, a process that revealed the careful compartmentalization he had maintained during his final years. The life of a man who had attempted to maintain normalcy within a household dominated by unresolved trauma was reflected in his clothes, engineering reference books, and modest collection of woodworking tools. Angela found letters that Albert had written but never sent, written to Michelle and expressing feelings and thoughts that he couldn't tell his living family. The father's quiet grief and his struggle to comprehend how to honor a murdered daughter while still participating in the world of the living were the only contents of the letters, which contained no dramatic revelations. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Janet Martino continued her solitary vigil, outliving her spouse by 18 years. Despite the increasing frequency with which the detectives assigned to Michelle's case changed, her annual visits to the Cedar Rapids Police Department continued. The case file grew thicker, not with new evidence, but with Janet's documented theories, letters from other victims' families, and the careful notes that successive investigators made about a mother who refused to accept that some questions might never be answered. The breakthrough in Janet's accumulated materials came not during her lifetime, but later on. She died on November 3, 2011, at the age of 79, from complications of congestive heart failure. Angela, now 44 and raising 2 teenage children of her own, inherited the family home on 8th Avenue Northeast and faced the monumental task of sorting through 32 years of obsessive documentation. Michelle's bedroom had become a museum of frustrated investigation. Police reports, newspaper clippings, correspondence with Midwest families, and Janet's intricate maps and timelines were all in boxes. Maintained with deteriorating coherence, Angela approached the task systematically. Understanding that simply discarding her mother's life work would feel like a final betrayal of Michelle's memory, she began scanning documents, organizing materials into digital files, and creating databases that would allow her to search for patterns and connections that had been invisible when scattered across physical storage. The process, which involved working weekends for nearly 2 years, gradually transformed cardboard boxes and manila folders into searchable digital archives. Angela was surprised by what she discovered in that enormous collection. Buried among the unfounded theories and desperate speculation was evidence of genuine investigative insight. Janet's correspondence network had identified legitimate connections between several unsolved cases in eastern Iowa,
due to the fact that the crimes cross county and state boundaries, patterns that individual jurisdictions had never recognized. More importantly, Janet had maintained meticulous records of every person who had been questioned during the initial investigation into Michelle's murder, which resulted in the creation of an informal database of potential suspects that would be useful in the event that brand new forensic methods were developed. Angela made contact with the Cedar Rapids Police Department in 2017 and offered to give her mother's archived materials full digital access. Angela's methodical approach was immediately recognized by Detective Matt Deniger, who had just been given the task of reviewing cold cases for potential DNA analysis, something fundamentally different from Janet's desperate obsession. Where Janet had been driven by grief and magical thinking, Angela brought methodical organization and emotional stability to the question of Michelle's unsolved murder. Detective Jennifer Rothell discovered the misfiled evidence box on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July 2006 during a mandatory reorganization of the Cedar Rapids Police Department's property and evidence storage facility. The department had recently moved its evidence archives, are being relocated from the cramped basement of the old municipal building to a climate-controlled warehouse on the industrial southwest side of the city, as part of a larger modernization project that is supported by federal grants and aims to enhance evidence preservation and chain of custody procedures. Every piece of stored evidence had to be photographed, reinvented, and transferred to the computerized tracking system at the new facility as part of the reorganization. Rothell, a veteran of 12 years who had been given to the property unit as a temporary assignment before her planned retirement, she spent long summer days sorting through decades' worth of case materials, which represented the archaeological layers of the criminal history of Cedar Rapids. The Martino evidence box was tucked away behind several 1980s-era containers of materials for reconstructing traffic accidents that had been misplaced during a previous reorganization that no one could recall or document. There were indications of environmental stress, water staining along the bottom edges from a pipe leak that had occurred sometime in the 1990s, dust accumulation suggesting years of neglect, and a handwritten label whose ink had faded to barely legible brown script that read Martino Homicide 1279. Rothel carefully lifted the box and noted its surprising weight. She found herself inside, looking at evidence from a case that was 7 years before her career as a police officer. The original inventory sheet, which appeared to have been written on an IBM 43 items gathered during the investigation into Michelle Martino's murder, were listed on a select electric typewriter. Most were routine materials: photographs of the crime scene, transcripts of witness statements, parking lot soil samples, and fiber evidence that, given 1979's forensic limitations, had produced no useful matches. Rothel, however, paused in the oppressive basement air due to a few items. Evidence bag 17 contained Michelle's red winter coat. The rust-brown, decades-old bloodstains on the stiff fabric had oxidized but remained easily observable. Blood samples taken from the interior of the Buick were stored in evidence bag 19, sealed in glass vials with red evidence tape and signed by the collecting technician. The labels indicated that some blood appeared inconsistent with Michelle's type. O-positive samples found on the steering wheel and dashboard, when Michelle's blood type was documented as A-positive. The most significant piece of forensic evidence came from the foreign blood samples. From the initial examination, however, in 1979, they had produced nothing of investigative value. Blood typing could eliminate suspects, but couldn't positively identify individuals with the precision that modern investigations demanded. Following FBI guidelines for evidence collection, the samples had been preserved with careful protocol. However, up until the middle of the 1980s, when DNA analysis technology emerged, they remained essentially ineffective. Rothel discovered the original forensics extensive notes, examination by Robert Wallace, a crime scene technician, whose meticulous record-keeping methods were legendary among longtime Cedar Rapids officers. Wallace had taken photographs of each collection site and documented the precise location as well as the appearance of each stain after collecting blood samples from 17 different locations inside the Buick. His notes indicated his suspicion that the O-positive blood came from the perpetrator, likely the result of defensive wounds inflicted by Michelle during her desperate struggle for survival. More importantly, Rothel discovered that the fingernail scrapings taken from Michelle's body during her autopsy had been stored in sealed containers that had not been damaged or contaminated. According to the medical examiner's notes, Michelle had scratched her attacker during the violent encounter, as evidenced by the recovery of tissue and blood from beneath several of her fingernails. In 1979, this biological material had been noted, but couldn't be analyzed with any useful specificity. By 2006, it was possible DNA evidence that could scientifically identify Michelle's killer. Rothel's routine inventory task became something far more important when she realized what she was holding. She got in touch with Detective Matt Denninger right away. He had just been put in charge of the department's cold case unit and was tasked with finding older cases that could benefit from modern forensic analysis. Denninger arrived at the storage facility within 30 minutes. His interest heightened by the fact that Michelle Martino's murder remained one of Cedar Rapids' most notorious unsolved cases. Denninger carefully examined each evidence item, understanding that the preservation quality would determine whether DNA analysis could succeed. Since 1979, the blood vials had been sealed to keep the genetic material safe from contamination from the environment. The fingernail scrapings had been stored in airtight containers at room temperature. Not ideal by today's standards, but possibly sufficient for the sophisticated extraction methods that had developed over the previous 10 years. The evolution of DNA forensic technology had been dramatic since the technique's first criminal application in the mid-1980s. Early DNA analysis required relatively large samples of fresh biological material and could take months to process. By 2006, new methods allowed analysts to extract usable genetic profiles from microscopic samples, degraded evidence, and biological material that had been stored for decades under less than optimal conditions. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation's Criminalistics Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing the type of aged samples preserved in Michelle's case. Deniger initiated the formal process of submitting evidence for DNA analysis in August 2006, understanding that bureaucratic procedures and laboratory backlogs meant that results might take months or even years. The blood samples and fingernail scrapings were accompanied by extensive documentation outlining the case history and the potential significance of a successful DNA recovery, as they were transported to the state laboratory in Ankeny under strict chain of custody protocols. The age and condition of the biological samples made the laboratory analysis take nearly 18 months. The blood vials yielded partial DNA profiles that were sufficient for comparison purposes, but not ideal for database searches. The fingernail scrapings proved more productive, containing skin cells that had remained remarkably well preserved despite their age. The director of the laboratory, Dr. Michael Thompson, presented preliminary findings that confirmed Robert Wallace's 1979 suspicions. The foreign blood and tissue samples came from someone other than Michelle Martino. The DNA profile was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index, the national database that compared genetic evidence from crime scenes against profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees.
Deniger awaited the confirmation that would show that there was a match. Recognizing that CODIS hits had helped solve a number of cold cases by locating the culprits whose DNA had been collected from previous arrests for unrelated offenses. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and there was no match. Either the person who killed Michelle Martino had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection, or had died before DNA database requirements were widely implemented. The investigation once more came to a halt, this time due to a crucial difference. Waiting for the technological or investigative breakthrough that would finally assign a name to the genetic code, the DNA profile existed as a permanent scientific fingerprint. Deniger worked on the case file, looking at the evidence from time to time and thinking of new ways to find Michelle's killer. After nearly 3 decades of waiting, the profile was silently comparing itself to each new entry in CODIS in search of the right match. The new development began not in a police laboratory, but in the suburban basement of a genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore, who had spent the previous decade pioneering techniques that transformed recreational ancestry research into a forensic investigative tool. By 2018, Moore had established herself as the leading expert in applying consumer DNA databases to criminal investigations, using the same genetic comparison methods that helped adoptees find biological parents to instead identify violent offenders who had evaded traditional law enforcement for decades. Detective Matt Deniger contacted Moore in September 2018 after reading about her success solving the Golden State Killer case in California. That investigation had demonstrated that genealogical database searches could match even partial DNA profiles from decades-old evidence to perpetrators, circumventing CODIS's requirements for direct matches to people already in the criminal justice system. The methodology exploited a simple, biological truth. Everyone shares genetic material with relatives, and those relationships leave quantifiable signatures in DNA that can be traced through family trees. Moore agreed to look at the DNA profile that was taken from Michelle Martino's fingernail scrapings because he knew that this was the kind of cold investigation where genetic genealogy could get results that traditional methods couldn't. The process began with the upload of the DNA profile from the crime scene to GEDmatch,
a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry could freely share their genetic information in order to locate relatives. The upload resulted in immediate outcomes, not a direct match with the killer, but connections to dozens of distant cousins whose genetic overlap with the DNA from the crime scene suggested common ancestry several generations earlier. Moore began the painstaking work of constructing family trees for each identified cousin, working backward through birth using death certificates, marriage records, census data, and obituaries. We were able to locate common ancestors who had resided in Iowa in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The genealogical research consumed 6 weeks of intensive work, during which Moore constructed elaborate family trees that eventually converged on a married couple named Peter and Ida Burns, who had homesteaded land in Lynn County during the 1880s. The Burns family had produced numerous descendants who remained in eastern Iowa across multiple generations, creating a genetic web that connected the DNA from the crime scene to dozens of potential suspects through various family branches. By analyzing age, gender, and location, we were able to more systematically eliminate potential suspects. Based on the DNA profile's Y chromosome markers, the killer had to be male. He had to be old enough in December 1979 to have committed the crime, which meant birth dates before approximately 1964. In order to justify his presence at the Westdale Mall he needed to have a connection to Cedar Rapids or the surrounding area, the night Michelle was murdered. The suspect pool was reduced by these filters to 6 people, all of whom were descendants of Peter and Ida Burns in different family lines. Devinger received Moore's preliminary report on November 28, 2018, and felt the familiar acceleration of pulse that accompanied genuine investigative breakthroughs. The 6 potential suspects ranged in age from 54 to 68, all living within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Rapids. 2 had died in the intervening decades. 3 had criminal records that made them believable as potential suspects in a violent crime. 1 name showed up, and there were no obvious red flags. Jerry Lynn Burns is 64 years old and resides in Manchester, Iowa, about 40 miles north of Cedar Rapids. Now the problem was getting DNA samples from the living suspects to see which ones matched the profile at the crime scene. Direct requests for voluntary samples risked alerting a guilty suspect and potentially triggering flight or evidence destruction. Deninger needed to collect DNA surreptitiously, using methods that courts had repeatedly affirmed as legal abandoned biological material that individuals had discarded without any expectation of privacy. The surveillance of Jerry Burns began on December 3, 2018. In Manchester, a small town of 5,000 people, where Burns owned a farm supply business and had lived for most of his adult life, undercover officers followed him through his daily activities. He seemed to live a normal life, going to Methodist church services and eating lunch at Casey's General Store, conducting business transactions with the unhurried pace typical of rural Iowa commerce. On December 6, Burns threw away a drinking straw after finishing a soda at a nearby restaurant, creating the opportunity for DNA collection. Officers retrieved the straw from a public trash receptacle and submitted it immediately to the state laboratory for comparison against the Martino crime scene profile. Deninger, who was aware that a positive match would resolve a case that had afflicted Cedar Rapids for a total of 39 years, found the 72-hour processing time for the analysis to be interminable. The laboratory director called Deninger at 2:15 p.m. on December 10, 2018. The DNA from Jerry Burns' discarded straw matched the profile from Michelle Martino's fingernail scrapings with the statistical certainty of 1 in several trillion. After nearly 4 decades, Michelle's killer had been identified with scientific precision that admitted no reasonable doubt. Denninger spent the following week building a comprehensive background investigation into Jerry Burns before executing an arrest. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had lived an outwardly conventional life while harboring secrets that no one in Manchester suspected. Burns had been 25 years old in December 1979, living in Cedar Rapids and working in construction. He had no documented connection to Michelle Martino, no obvious motive, and no prior criminal record that would have made him a suspect in the original investigation. Additional research found patterns that were troubling. Burns was questioned briefly as part of a larger canvassing of young men who lived or worked in Cedar Rapids during the initial investigation. However, the interview was brief and never led to serious investigation. He had moved to Manchester in 1982, marrying and establishing his farm supply business while maintaining complete silence about whatever had transpired in the Westdale Mall parking lot 3 years earlier. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle Martino's murder, the suspect was apprehended. Denninger led a group of police officers to Burns' farm supply store in Manchester, where he was taken into custody without incident in front of stunned employees and customers who were familiar with Burns as a quiet, unassuming businessman. The arrest warrant detailed the DNA evidence with clinical precision, explaining how genetic genealogy had accomplished what 3 decades of traditional investigation could not. Burns' response to interrogation revealed nothing. He refused to comply, despite invoking his constitutional right to remain silent,
Provide any statement about Michelle's murder. His silence denied investigators and Michelle's family any insight into the motivation or circumstances that had led a 25-year-old construction worker to commit such horrific violence against a teenage stranger. Even though the DNA evidence made his cooperation unnecessary for prosecution purposes, the investigation into Jerry Lynn Burns' past accelerated immediately after his arrest, revealing a previously unknown pattern of deception and violence. Beneath the surface of small-town respectability for 4 decades, Detective Matt Denninger assembled a task force that included investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and FBI behavioral analysts who specialized in reconstructing the histories of violent offenders who had successfully evaded detection for extended periods. Burns' criminal history before Michelle's murder was minimal: a 1977 citation for disorderly conduct and a 1978 arrest for public intoxication, both resolved with minuscule fines. Nothing in these records suggested capacity for the extreme violence that characterized Michelle Martino's killing. However, the FBI analysts found that the absence of documented criminal activity prior to December 1979 made psychological sense. Midway through their 20s, when impulse control mechanisms that typically matured during adolescence sometimes fail catastrophically, many violent offenders commit their first serious crimes. The task force discovered that Burns had been living in December 1979, I moved to Cedar Rapids and began working for a residential construction company, renting a basement apartment on the southwest side of the city. During the time that Michelle was killed, his work schedule had him in close proximity to Westdale Mall. The randomness of the encounter, a construction worker and a high school senior with no apparent prior connection, fit the profile of despite the fact that nothing in his employment record suggested any specific reason he would have been at the mall that evening. Opportunistic prey rather than a deliberate murder. When investigators looked at Burns' movements in the years immediately following Michelle's murder, more troubling patterns emerged. He had relocated to Manchester in June 1982, a move that appeared sudden and without obvious economic motivation. His employment in construction in Cedar Rapids had been steady and fairly well paid, yet he had abandoned it to purchase a struggling farm supply business in a town where he had no established relationships or family connections. The relocation suggested someone creating distance from a place that held dangerous associations. Denninger's team interviewed dozens of Manchester residents who had known Burns across the decades, searching for indications of violent tendencies or suspicious behavior that might have gone unreported. The portrait that emerged was unsettling in its ordinariness. Burns had been a businessman who kept to himself and was somewhat distant from the community, but upheld friendly relationships with neighbors and customers. Although the separation appeared amicable and did not involve any documented instances of domestic violence or protective orders, his marriage had ended in divorce in 1995. However, concealed within these seemingly normal routines were troubling incidents that had not been reported to authorities. During the 1980s and 1990s, 3 women who had worked for Burns at various times described awkward interactions, inappropriate comments, intrusive questions about their personal lives, and boundary violations that did not amount to harassment that could result in legal action. None had filed formal complaints, attributing Burns' behavior to social awkwardness rather than malicious intent. The pattern suggested a person who maintained plausible deniability while pushing their limits and evaluating their vulnerability. The evidence gathered during the December 2018 warrant-authorized search of Burns' Manchester property changed our perception of his decades-long deception. The primary residence had been. Ground-penetrating radar was used by investigators to find anomalies beneath the concrete floor of a detached garage that Burns had built in 1986. There was nothing obvious that could be used as evidence. Excavation revealed a metal lockbox buried 3 feet below the surface, sealed in plastic, and preserved against moisture damage. The contents of the lockbox revealed a secret life that went against everything Manchester residents thought they knew about Jerry Burns. There were dozens of pictures inside that showed young women, without their knowledge, shared with others. The photos dated from the early 1980s through the mid-1990s, all depicting blonde women between approximately 16 and 25 years old, often captured in parking lots or shopping areas where they appeared unaware of being surveilled. More importantly, the box contained a woman's watch, several pieces of inexpensive jewelry, a student identification card from a University of Iowa student who had been reported missing in 1985, and a small ceramic. All of these items appeared to be trophies, angel figurine. Each item had been carefully preserved in individual plastic bags labeled with dates and cryptic annotations that suggested Burns maintained a catalog of encounters or fantasies that had never been reported to authorities. Rachel Thompson had vanished from Iowa City on March 12, 1985, while walking to her apartment from a late-night study session. The student ID card led investigators to the case. Thompson's case had remained unsolved, her body never recovered, her fate a mystery. Despite the absence of DNA evidence or physical remains, it was uncertain whether Burns would be prosecuted for her disappearance because of the presence of her ID in his possession. The photographs were found to have been taken in multiple locations throughout eastern Iowa, including Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, Waterloo, and Dubuque. This suggests that Burns continued his predatory surveillance activities throughout a large geographic area in the decade that followed Michelle's murder. The photographs themselves weren't illegal, but they documented a pattern of stalking and obsessive focus on young blonde women that provided insight into Burns' psychological profile. When the task force reconstructed the timeline of the initial 1979 investigation into Michelle's murder, they made the discovery that devastated Denninger. Burns had been interviewed on January 8, 1980, as part of the systematic canvassing of young men who lived or worked in Cedar Rapids. A single detective had conducted the interview, who found nothing suspicious in Burns' account of his activities on December 19th. Burns claimed he had been home alone that evening watching television, an alibi that was impossible to verify, but equally impossible to disprove. The interview notes revealed that the detective had considered Burns an unlikely suspect, purely on demeanor and presentation. Burns had appeared cooperative, had answered questions without evasion, and had voluntarily provided blood samples for type comparison. His blood type, O positive, and it had been found to match the foreign blood in Michelle's car. However, in 1980, that coincidence was not conclusive. Approximately 42% of the population shared O-positive blood type, making it insufficient rounds for focused investigation. More tragically, the original investigation had come within days of potentially solving the case through traditional methods. Due to his proximity to Westdale Mall and the blood type match,
Detective Lyle Lenth had determined that Burns deserved further investigation. Lenth had planned to conduct follow-up interviews and surveillance, but the investigation had been overwhelmed by hundreds of potential suspects and thousands of investigative leads. Burns had simply vanished into the plethora of possibilities and had never received the sustained attention that could have identified him as Michelle's killer decades earlier. The trial of Jerry Lynn Burns began on February 10, 2020.
40 years and 2 months after Michelle Martino's death in the Lynn County Courthouse, the time between her arrest and Burns' defense attorneys had aggressively challenged the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence that served as the prosecution's foundation throughout the course of the trial, which lasted 13 months. In light of consumer DNA testing and privacy expectations, the legal arguments raised novel constitutional questions about whether law enforcement's use of public genealogical databases constitutes an unlawful search. Judge Fee Hoover ruled that the evidence was admissible, finding that individuals who voluntarily uploaded when they entered their genetic information into public databases, they had no reasonable expectation that the information would remain secure from scrutiny by law enforcement. Despite the fact that the decision was in line with precedents established in other nationwide genetic genealogy cases, it remained legally contentious and would likely be put to the test through appeals regardless of the outcome of the trial. The prosecution, led by Lynn County Attorney Jerry Vandersanden, built its case on the irrefutable scientific evidence that connected Burns to Michelle's murder. The DNA match had a statistical probability of 1 in several trillion, which effectively ruled out any chance of coincidental genetic overlap because the number was so enormously certain. Experts in forensics testified about the advanced extraction methods that had recovered usable genetic profiles from degraded samples and the meticulous chain of custody that had preserved the biological evidence for 4 decades. The emotional centerpiece of the trial came when Angela Martino Dreyer took the witness stand to speak about her sister's life and the decades of grief that had consumed their family. Angela, now 52 years old, described Michelle as a conscientious student, devoted daughter, and beloved sister whose murder had created a permanent void that could never be filled. She talked about their father Albert's death, from what she called accumulated heartbreak, and their mother Janet's 32-year obsession with solving the case. She also talked about the relief of finally knowing the truth after 4 decades of uncertainty. By stressing that there is no evidence of a connection between Michelle and Burns, the defense made an effort to sway the jury into a reasonable doubt. Given the deliberate nature of the attack, they argued the chance encounter theory that Burns had chosen Michelle as a victim at random in a mall parking lot seemed implausible. After the DNA match, they said, the investigation had narrowed its focus too much on Burns, leaving out other possibilities for how his genetic material got on Michelle's physique. But the prosecution countered with the buried lockbox evidence, presenting the photographs of surveilled women and the personal items that suggested a pattern of predatory behavior extending across years. Despite the fact that Burns could not be charged with crimes related to those materials without additional evidence, their existence painted a picture of a person whose violent obsessions were hidden behind their outward normality. The student ID card of Rachel Thompson, the University of Iowa student who went missing. Even without explicit testimony about Thompson's unsolved disappearance, it particularly resonated with jurors who understood its implication. Burns maintained his silence immediately following his arrest and never testified. Knowing that his inability to explain the DNA evidence would only strengthen the state's case, his attorneys advised against giving prosecutors the opportunity to cross-examine him. His demeanor throughout the trial remained impassive, showing no visible emotional response to testimony about the violence he had inflicted on Michelle or the suffering her family had endured. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The speed with which decisions were made was a result of the overwhelming strength of the DNA evidence and the absence of any plausible alternatives. Burns was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole by Judge Hoover, which is the mandatory punishment for first-degree murder under Iowa law. Burns was 66 years of age. He would die in prison. A measure of justice was served by the conviction, but it was fundamentally incomplete. Burns's refusal to explain his actions meant that critical questions would never be answered. Michelle, what had sparked the ferocious violence that was the attack's hallmark? Beyond Rachel Thompson, were there any other victims whose disappearances remain unsolved? Despite providing legal closure, the silence denied closure. Angela Martino Dreyer was informed of the verdict by phone, sitting in her Iowa City home surrounded by family members who had accompanied her through the trial. The relief she felt was complex. She was happy that Burns would be held accountable, she was sad that her parents had died without knowing this, and she was angry that it had taken 4 decades to accomplish what DNA technology could now do in a matter of months. Angela was able to finally plan the memorial service that had been impossible while there was still uncertainty because Michelle's case had been officially closed. On April 12, 2020, the event took place at First Presbyterian Church in Cedar Rapids, originally planned as an in-person gathering, but converted to a virtual ceremony due to COVID-19 pandemic restrictions that had emerged during the preceding weeks. The digital format felt oddly appropriate, a 21st century memorial for a case that had been solved through cutting-edge technology, unavailable when Michelle died. During the service, Angela discussed the significance of perseverance and the ability of scientific advancement to justice that seemed permanently out of reach. She thanked Detective Matt Denninger, genetic genealogist Cece Moore, and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation for their work solving Michelle's case. Most importantly, she announced the Michelle Marie Martino Foundation, a nonprofit organization that supports families coping with the unique grief of unsolved violent crimes and funds DNA analysis of cold cases. The foundation would make use of the money from a settlement for victims' compensation and private donations to provide grants for genetic genealogy analysis in cases where traditional investigation had reached dead ends. Angela was aware that she was unable to resurrect her sister or bring back the years her parents had lost to grief. However, she was able to guarantee that Michelle's passing would contribute to the resolution of the bewildering mysteries surrounding other families and would stop the prolonged suffering that had characterized the Martino family's existence. The small ceramic angel figurine recovered from Burns's buried lockbox was returned to Angela after being processed as evidence. Angela was concerned that the item might have belonged to Michelle and had been taken from her purse or person during the attack, even though no specific victim had been identified. As a tangible reminder of the significance of the work, she placed it on a shelf in her home office where she managed the foundation's operations. After 30 years with the Cedar Rapids Police Department, Detective Denninger will retire in December 2020, a career that had culminated in solving the case that had haunted the department since before he joined the force. He continued to serve as an advisor for the Martino Foundation, assisting in the evaluation of cold cases that might benefit from genetic genealogy analysis, and acting as a link between bereaved families and the intricate forensic science that might provide answers. Angela paid a visit to the Martino family plot in Cedar Memorial Cemetery on December 19, 2021, 42 years after Michelle was murdered. In front of the graves of Janet and Albert now stood a memorial plaque, which was erected after the conclusion of the trial. Michelle's name, birth and death dates, and the straightforward inscription, "Beloved daughter and sister, forever 18, were all engraved. Justice delayed but not denied. Angela stood in the winter cold, remembering the sister she had known only briefly, and the parents whose lives had been consumed by unanswered questions. The grief remained, would always remain, but it had been transformed by knowledge. Michelle might be finally at rest. The extended vigil of the family was over. Was it true that the truth took 40 years to emerge, required technologies that did not exist when Michelle died, and relied on a grieving mother's persistent obsession and a surviving sister's systematic organization? However, it had emerged. Jerry Burns would spend his remaining years in prison, and Michelle Martino's name would be remembered not as an unsolved mystery, but as a solved case that demonstrated the power of scientific advancement to deliver justice across vast time intervals.